While out prospecting in the mountains of northern British Columbia, Don had an encounter with a Sasquatch that can only be described as something straight out of a horror movie. But before we get into his encounter, welcome back to Dark Wilderness. If you've had an encounter with anything unexplained that you would like to have shared on the show, please email me at the link below. And if you like today's story, please gently slap that like button. And please take your gold pan, put it in the river, scoop up that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future content. Now, let's get into today's encounter. This encounter comes from Don and it happened in the summer of 1988. Before his encounter, Don was a self proclaimed skeptic. Even though he grew up hearing stories of Sasquatch, he had seen the Patterson-Gimlin film, he just had not made up in his own mind if all of that was a hoax or if there was truth behind all those stories and that film. He had grew up in the Okanagan Valley, which is located in central British Columbia, and he spent a ton of time out in the mountains. So to him, because he spent so much time out in the mountains and had never seen any sign of a Sasquatch or any proof of a Sasquatch, in his mind, he was thinking that all those stories were just that, just stories. However, that summer in 1988, the company he had been working for the past 4 years closed their doors and he soon found himself out of work. Luckily for him, he was able to secure a new job. However, this job was located up in Alaska, just south of Fairbanks, and it was working for a logging company. When he found out that he had got this position, there was going to be a little bit of a time delay between when he found out and when he was actually going to be starting, and that delay was about a month and a half. So now he was faced with the decision of what he was going to do with that time. Since he had just lost his job, money was tight, he really did not want to have to be paying rent on his apartment for another month. So what he decided to do is he sold all of his belongings, loaded up his truck with whatever he had left, and then he hit the road. He grew up hearing stories of the Alaskan gold rush, the Yukon gold rush, and he had always really been fascinated with that. He always wanted to try prospecting. So on his way out of town, he stopped at a local shop, he picked up a miner's axe, he picked up a gold pan, and then he headed north to Dawson Creek. Once he got to Dawson Creek, he turned onto Highway 97 and he started making his way north towards Alaska. Highway 97 is the Alaskan Highway and it starts in Dawson Creek, British Columbia. It runs for 1,382 kilometers and it eventually ends at Delta Junction, Alaska. Now, Don's plan was as he made his way down the Alaskan Highway, he was going to stop at the various logging roads, trails, cutouts, and he was going to try his hand at prospecting any form of river or stream or creek he came across. The first 2 weeks went absolutely great. He was having a great time. He had no real luck prospecting, but he was really enjoying learning this new hobby. After a couple of weeks, he was getting close to the BC and Yukon territory border, and he was along this very desolate part of the highway. There's no communities really for just miles upon miles. And as he was making his way down that part of the highway, he noticed off to his left a really overgrown trail that was running up the side of this one mountain. He could tell by the way that the mountains were off to that side that there was most likely going to be a valley in between them with a river flowing through it. So he figured, you know what, I still have tons of time. He decided he was going to drive down this road, even though it looked fairly rough and not well used at all. But he turned his truck off the highway, got onto this trail, and he started making his way up the side of this mountain. As he was going, he only made it about a couple hundred yards, and that trail became incredibly rough. And after about another 200 yards of that, he was really kind of starting to think to himself, like, did I make a good decision here? Should I turn around? The only problem was he could not turn around. The trail was just way too small. So at this point, he was left with really one of two options. He either continue going down this trail or he would have to try to back down it. However, because the trail was so narrow and so steep, he did not want to back down it. He did not want to risk damaging his truck by sliding off and hitting a tree. His truck was his lifeline. This was well before cell phones. So if something happened to his truck, he would have been forced to walk all the way back to the highway and just hope that somebody happened to pass by that would be able to give him a hand. So he just kept pushing further down this trail the entire time, being completely paranoid that something was going to happen to the truck. And he was paying attention to his odometer as well, just to see how far he had traveled, just in case something happened, he would know how far of a walk it would be back to the highway. And after he had drove for a little over 3 kilometers, which is just a little bit over 2 miles, He came to a clearing that was about 50 yards wide by 75 yards long. And when he pulled up into the clearing, he stopped, put his truck in park, and he just kind of took a minute to collect himself just because that drive up had been so incredibly stressful on him. As he sat there in his truck, just kind of looking around, getting a lay of the land, he noticed the trees off to his right just did not look quite right. So he stared at them for a couple of seconds, and then he realized the reason they were looking like that was because he was only seeing the tops of them. There was, in fact, a valley there, just like he had hoped. So he decided he was going to get out of his truck and he was going to walk over to the tree line to see if there was a river at the bottom of this valley and how steep it was. As soon as he stepped out of his truck, he could hear the sound of running water coming from in that direction. So he instantly got excited and he started to think to himself, you know what, when I get to this tree line, if this slope's not too bad, if this looks like a decent river or stream, I might just stay here for a couple of days. Because at that point, he was really not looking forward to making the drive back down that trail. So he made his way up towards that tree line where that slope started. And when he got there, he looked down and he could tell that this slope was actually fairly steep, but there was indeed a river at the bottom. It was about 150 to 175 yards away. He contemplated for a couple of seconds about going down and checking it out, but because there was only about an hour of daylight left, he decided that was not a good idea. He did not want to risk falling and hurting himself and having to spend the night at the bottom of this valley by himself. So he made his way back to his truck, unloaded his tent, he set it up, he went around the site, gathered a bunch of rocks, made a fire ring, made a fire, had some food, and then he called it a night. The next morning, right at the crack of dawn, he woke up, grabbed his prospector axe, grabbed his gold pan, grabbed a pack with some water and food, and he made his way towards that slope. Once he got to the slope and he started making his way down, he realized that it was a lot more steep than he had originally thought. But he was able to get down it fairly easily by holding on to trees and using trees as footing. But as he was going down, he started to think to himself, you know what, this is pretty easy going down, but it's going to be really hard to get back up at the end of the day. So he made a commitment to himself at that point that with 3 hours left in the day, he would start making his way back up to his truck because he did not want to have to try to navigate going up this slope, even though it was only about 150 to 175 yards. He did not want to have to deal with that in the dark when he could not check his footing properly. So he spent the entire day making his way down this little river, prospecting along the way. Again, he did not have any luck with that. And about 3 hours before dark, he turned around and he started making his way back to where he had come down that slope. When he got there was still about 2.5 hours of daylight left, and he figured, you know what, it's not going to take that long to climb back up this slope. I might as well prospect just a little bit longer and then call it a night. So he pulled his gold pan out of his pack, dipped it into the river, swooshed some rocks around, and all of a sudden he heard a super loud splash come from his right. It kind of startled him a bit, and he turned and looked in that direction, but he didn't see anything. He could tell that the water had been disturbed by something fairly large, but he did not see what made that splash. So he stared in that direction for a couple of seconds, and then he went back to prospecting, just telling himself that that was more than likely just a beaver. However, as he continued to prospect, he kept thinking to himself, was this really a beaver? Are there even beavers here? And it really started to mess with his mind a bit, and he found himself about every 10 to 15 seconds looking back in that direction, trying to figure out what made that splash. After about 10 minutes, the feeling kind of subsided a little bit, and he just carried on with prospecting. A couple of minutes later, again, he heard another really loud splash come from that same direction. He again quickly whipped his head around, looked at that direction, and saw nothing. He saw that the water had been disturbed again, but still no sign of whatever was making that splashing noise. He stared at that direction for a few seconds, and as soon as he turned his head back to look at his gold pan, there was another splash. At this point, because he did not know what was making that splashing, he decided he was just going to pack up his gear, head back up that slope, and he was just going to call it a night. So he started loading his gold pan into his pack, when all of a sudden he could hear loud cracking coming from the other side of that river. Now, this river was not very wide. It was only about 30 yards wide, so he could hear anything on the other side fairly well, and he could hear something absolutely massive and heavy making its way through the bush. He had stopped mid-action of loading his gold pan into his pack, and he was just staring across a river into the trees. After staring for a few seconds, he caught a glimpse of something dark reddish brown moving through the brush. His first thought was that that was most likely a grizzly, and at this point, his heart was just racing, and he decided he was just going to abandon packing up his stuff, and he was just going to head up the slope as quick as he could. So he dropped his pack, and he started running up this slope. But because the slope was so steep, he was not making very good time going up. He was really struggling trying to get back up. He had to grab onto trees, and it was more of a climb than actually walking or running up this hill. As he made his way up the slope, he kept turning around and looking behind him to see if whatever that was following him. When he was about 3/4 of the way up, he turned, looked back down towards the river, and he saw something absolutely massive covered in reddish brown hair standing on two legs looking right back up at him. His thought in that moment was that that was a grizzly, just like he had thought it was a grizzly when he saw it moving through the bush, and it absolutely horrified him. He scrambled the rest of the way to the top of the slope, and then he ran straight for his truck. Once he was in his truck, he decided, you know what? Forget sleeping in my tent tonight. I'm staying in the truck. I am not messing with the grizzly. He figured he would be a lot more safe in the truck. He stayed in the truck pretty much all night. Once the evening turned to night, he started to hear really strange sounds coming from in the woods that he described as sounding like a deep scream. Those sounds really put him on edge, even more so than those splashes did, and even more so than what he saw standing in the river, which at that point he was still thinking was a grizzly, because he had never heard anything like that before, and he had grew up in the Rockies. Shortly after hearing those screams, he decided he was going to start his truck, turn on his light so that he could see the clearing. So he started the ignition, hit the high beams, and almost instantly, right across the clearing about 70 yards away, he could see something absolutely massive moving through the bush line. Now, it was 70 yards away. He did not get a good look at it, but he said that it had to have been 8.5 to 9 feet tall. However, it did not really put him on edge at this point, at least nothing compared to how he felt when he thought that he was being followed by a grizzly. He was a little bit more intrigued at this point, trying to figure out exactly what he had just seen, kind of running through different things in his mind. About an hour later, he started to hear those screams again, except they sounded a lot closer, and at one point it sounded like it was directly behind his truck. So Don, who at this point had his truck turned off, just put his foot on the brake so that he could see whatever was behind him. It would be the red light of the brakes, but it would be better than just turning around and seeing nothing in the darkness. So he pushed his foot on the brake, looked in his rearview mirror, and he just saw what looked like a face looking down through the back of his truck directly at him. He froze in this moment. He did not know what to do. He contemplated flooring it, but he had no idea where to go. He had no idea where this trail went. He didn't even know if he could turn his truck around in this clearing. He had not attempted it. The truck was sitting exactly where it was when he pulled into the clearing. So he just sat there completely frozen with fear, looking in his rearview mirror at this face looking through back at him. After a few seconds, this face disappeared from view, and he felt his truck kind of do a little bit of a shake. Nothing violent, just almost like something brushed up against the side of it. Don sat there holding his steering wheel. He said his heart was just absolutely racing at this point, and he was absolutely terrified. He did not know what to do. He felt completely trapped in this moment just because he did not know where this trail went. He did not know if he could turn around, and he knew that there's no way in the dark he would be able to back down this thing. So he sat there with the truck running, just hoping that this thing would not come back, but it did come back multiple times through the night. All night, he would see this Sasquatch moving along the passenger side of the truck. He saw it out his window, out the back, and at one point, it was standing directly in front of his truck, about 5 yards away, with the headlights shining right on it. All night, he was absolutely petrified. He was really fearful that this Sasquatch was going to do something to physically harm him. However, around 3:30 in the morning, he started to get even more worried because he was looking at his gas gauge and he only had about a quarter of a tank left. Now, he did not fill his jerry cans up the last time he filled up his truck, which at this point he was really regretting, However, there was no way he was going to get out and actually fill his truck up at this point, not with this Sasquatch walking around. But he was really getting concerned because he knew he needed to conserve gas, which would mean he would have to turn the truck off. He did not know if it was the sound of the truck running that was keeping this Sasquatch away or what. So he was very hesitant to turn it off, but he knew that he had to. So he turned the truck off and he just turned the lights on running off a battery. Throughout the rest of the night, he saw it a few more times. Once dawn came, he went to start his truck and his truck would not start. His lights were on, but they were incredibly dim, but it just did not have enough battery power to actually turn the engine over. At this point, Don felt his heart sink because he knew that there's no way he could get his truck going and that he was going to be forced to have to walk all the way back to the highway. So he sat in his truck for quite a few hours, looking across this clearing, trying to see if this Sasquatch had come back or if it had gone. And when he had not seen it for several hours, he decided this was his opportunity. He was going to head to the highway and he was going to try getting help. So he mustered up all the courage he could. He grabbed his backpack, which had some water, quietly got out of the truck, and he said he felt like a kid trying to tiptoe across a kitchen to steal cookies or something. He said he was trying to move absolutely as quiet as possible as he was making his way down this trail. He had not gotten very far when he started to hear those same screams that he heard the night before coming from not too far behind him back up the trail towards his truck. At this point, he didn't know if he should run, if he should freeze, or just keep walking at the pace he was walking. He said he felt like something inside of him was telling him to just keep going, but go calm. So he just very calmly as he could, made his way down this trail towards the highway, periodically hearing those screams behind him. He did not turn around to look behind him the entire walk down this trail, but he said he could hear this Sasquatch moving through the bush, and at one point it sounded like there was more than one of them. Once he got to the highway, he did not hear them moving through the bush anymore. He did not hear any of the screams. So he started heading north down the highway. He walked for a couple of hours when he spotted a truck coming towards him. So he flagged the truck down. They pulled over to the side. He walked up. There were two older First Nations gentlemen in this truck, and they asked him if he needed any help. He told them that his truck was down this back trail, that his battery was dead, and they offered to give him a ride back to his truck and boost it as well. Don was incredibly happy about that, but he was also incredibly nervous because he did not want to go back to where his truck was because of everything that happened. But he knew that he had to go back for his truck because without his truck, he couldn't do absolutely anything. So reluctantly, he climbed into their truck and they made their way down the highway back up to that trail. When they got to the trail, they started making their way down the trail, and Don was really feeling uneasy at this point. Not so much only because of everything that had happened, but because he had not been 100% truthful with these gentlemen. He did not give them a heads up about what had happened. So as they were making their way down this trail, he started to tell them what had happened. And he thought that they were going to think he was absolutely crazy. He thought that they were going to kick him out of the truck. However, he said they just went quiet. He saw the driver look into the rearview mirror and just say, "Sabe." That really confused him because he had never heard that word before. He had never heard "Sabe." So he had no idea what that meant. As they continued down the trail, though, they got to his truck. These two gentlemen did not speak another word the entire time. When they got to his truck, they boosted it. They kind of waved to him, and they made their way back down the trail, and he followed. When they got down to the bottom of the trail at the highway, he got out, he walked up, and he started talking to them to thank them for their help. At this point, the driver of the truck outright asked him if he was doing anything that would have upset Sabe. And again, he had no idea what Sabe meant, but he started to piece it together. He started to piece together Sasquatch and Sabe and started to realize that this gentleman was referring to Sasquatch. So he said, "No, I wasn't doing anything. I was just doing a little bit of prospecting in the river." And this fellow said to him that that's the reason why this Sasquatch or potential Sasquatches were behaving the way they were. He said that they are incredibly territorial and they do not like when people remove things from their territory. So Don figures that based on what these First Nations gentlemen told him, that this Sasquatch was behaving that way because he was prospecting and that it thought that he was trying to take from the mountain from their home, and that's why they were behaving that way. Don's advice is if you're ever out in the woods or you're doing anything out in the mountains or anywhere, he said just always be mindful and show respect to the land, not only the animals, but to show respect for the land as well. And he said if you ever get a feeling like something's not right, he said just get out of there. And he said by all means, don't go driving down some road where you cannot turn around on. He said it's just not worth it. Well, that's it for today's encounter. As always, thanks for joining us. And if you have any comments, please leave it in the comments below. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on this. And I do reply to every comment as soon as I can. I also want to give you a heads up that I know I have not uploaded too much lately. I was sick for a week and I just started with a new company 2 weeks ago, so I was kind of trying to settle in with them. Now that I'm all settled, I will be back to uploading regularly. As well, I am planning on doing an on-site video. I just don't know if it's going to be a week from now or a month from now. I have not been out to the property in a while, so I don't even know if I can access it. We've had an incredibly fast melt here in Manitoba, so I don't know if the area is flooded or not. But that will be happening, and it's the site where the story Something Stalked Us Through the Woods happened, so I'm really looking forward to that, and it will be with my cousin. As well, if you haven't done so already, please scoop that subscribe button up with your gold pan, and I'll see you next time.